Gender, Literature, and Translation to honor the memory and the work of ASU's Regents Professor of Spanish and Portuguese, Dr. David William Foster, who taught at ASU for 50 years, more than 50 years. These were David's particular research interests, and this series is designed to highlight scholars who continue to work on these fields that he helped to pioneer. David was also a great friend to the library, and his friend has donated his papers and a portion of his personal library to us, making ours the largest collection on gender in the Southern Cone and the Southwest. Thank you. The lecture committee would like to thank, first and foremost, Dr. Virginia Foster, who has endowed this lecture in memory of her beloved David. We would also like to thank the people at Silk and the ASU Library who were involved in making today's lecture possible, especially Mike Tueller, Melissa King, Lauren Parra, Carla Leone, Marilyn Murphy, Patricia Oldle, Jacob Robertson, and Amy Caroline Watson. Lastly, I would also like to thank my other committee members, Ilana Luna, Cynthia Tompkins, Christopher Johnson, and especially our chair, Ligia Bezeha, for selecting and inviting Angeles to come here today. Today's lecture, entitled Documentary Reverberations Toward a Feminist Critique of Photos by/of Women, highlights photography, one of the many areas to which David dedicated his research. His last book, published posthumously in 2021, was The City as Photographic Text, Urban Documentary Photography of Sao Paulo. In the introduction, David told us that he would show us 10 chapters, 10 very different views of the enormous complexity of a city like Sao Paulo, but also 10 projects in which photography becomes a deeply engaging way of reading a major modern Latin American city, so crucial to the life of that continent. This book and his other writings on photography in Latin America and in the United States is just a fraction of David's valuable work, which we are certain will continue to inspire many generations to come. Our speaker today, Angeles Donoso Macaya, is a feminist immigrant educator, researcher, writer, and activist from Santiago, Chile, based in New York City. She teaches Latin American Visual Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center and is a professor of Spanish at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, CUNY. She is the author of The Insubordination of Photography, Documentary Practices Under Chile's Dictatorship, which received the Best Book Award in Latin American Visual Culture in 2021 and the Best Book Award in Recent History and Memory in 2022. Please welcome Dr. Angeles Donoso Macaya.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's do this. So I want to begin by thanking my colleagues Ligia, Sinead, Cynthia, Chris, and Ilana for the invitation and the warm welcome, the students of the International Letters and Culture, especially Carla, all the people involved in putting this event together. I know it takes a lot of work. I also want to thank Virginia and all of you who are present here to honor the memory of Professor David William Foster. I was fortunate actually to meet David briefly in 2009 when I was finishing my PhD and I submitted an article to Chasqui on Mario Bellatin's El Gran Vidrio. How lucky I was that he happened to be the journal's editor, because I had previous experience that were not as happy. He was so affable, so kind. You know, the article was accepted with revisions, and he was very patient. But of course, beyond his unforgettable personality, David's legacy as a scholar is truly, truly outstanding. I was looking at some of his books, and he was writing when I was 4 years old, so you can imagine how, I feel very, very honored by this invitation and also a bit intimidated, if I'm completely honest. So let me offer you this keynote lecture as a study session, as a rehearsal or an essay. And I guess in Spanish it works better because it's un ensayo, right? When you're rehearsing, you're ensayando. So this image that you see here behind the title and my name is an image of some documents scattered on a desk. I took this photo several years ago at the Women's and Genders Archive in Santiago. And I start with this snapshot because what I'm about to share here began to take shape there. And also because what I like to rehearse here is a situated interrogation of the traditional patriarchal modes of doing photography, criticism, and historiography. And the desk, or the table more broadly, is such a fundamental space. I'm even talking about this desk, right? For our work, as Barbara Smith suggested when she founded Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press in 1980. And writing almost 40 years later, Sara Ahmed also centers the table in her book, Queer Phenomenology. And these have been very important books for my work. So on the table, we not only cook, we eat, we share meals and experiences, but we also study, we display archival documents, we rehearse ideas, and we write. And I insist on this gesture of rehearsal, or ensayar in Spanish, because this essay is not definitive. But then again, as Adorno said, the essay, el ensayo, does never aim at a closed construction. On the contrary, it deals with the opaqueness of its objects. And I forgot to say, what you're looking at is, again, two tables, and every time that you see a circle around an image is because I want you to pay attention to that. So that book will show up again. It's okay if you don't know the title right now. So Adorno also said that the most intimate formal law of the essay is heresy. And perhaps my first heresy here is to begin a feminist reflection by quoting a white European cis man. The opaque object is here the triad visuality, women, and archives. And this triad, or not, truly expresses the problem of opacity, right? So when I said not here, nudo, I echo an eloquent image proposed by Chilean feminist sociologist Julieta Kirkwood in the 80s. Kirkwood, one of the founders of the feminist movement in 1983, she died of breast cancer shortly after in 1985. She used to call feminist knots those recurring issues which are difficult to grasp or for feminine to address or to resolve. And one of the knots that she herself studied and wrestled with was the relationship between the feminists, las feministas, and the political parties. And this is one of her major works, is Ser Política en Chile, being a politician in Chile, feminist and the parties. And the photo that you're seeing is Julia Kirkwood being arrested by some policemen on March 8 of 1984. So the knot visuality, women, and archives tangles many, many issues. The constantly denounced invisibility of women, between quotation marks, in different histories. For example, the erasure of women photographers in the histories of photography. The problem of the male gaze and or the reification of women, again, in mass media. The generalized opacity of women in the archives, and so on and so forth. But here I find the first impasse, and this rehearsal kind of hesitates, because what women, right, are these we were made invisible, objectified, erased? And I am certain that I am not asking anything new, that this is a long-standing concern in feminisms. Today I was actually reminding myself of Sojourner's truth, like, I'm not a woman, so this has been a long, long problem. But this is what rehearsing is about, right? Repeating, we rehearse, we repeat ideas, we test them. So I'm thinking just as performers, musicians, or dancers, not like at the rehearsal dinner, right? More like a artistic rehearsal. Rehearse dramatic text, movements, choreographies, and chords, adapting their voices and extremities, embodying the work in each rehearsal. This essay repeats, or echoes, and echo is a very important word for feminist thought, the ideas of many feminist theorists, historians, and writers who for decades have questioned the essentialist orientation of a kind of criticism that, despite defining itself as feminist or women-led, oriented, centered, ends up reproducing patriarchal structures and paradigms. So in the first and longer part of this rehearsal, I will try to emulate the way in which I study photos and archival materials. So I always write accompanied by the documents I analyze, spread out on a table, or open on my desk, right? We have the computer screen, basically, not a physical desk. So to let myself be guided by what these images show and suggest, but why they make me remember and imagine. And I'd like to formulate this with you today as a situated methodology and as a form of documentary reverberation. And I will say more about documentary reverberations in the second part of my talk, when I share more about two practices that I have studied in more depth, both related to the counter-visuality. And this is a notion by Nick Mirzoyev. He talks about visuality and counter-visuality, but I don't want to give too many quotes and references. So the counter-visuality formulated by the women's and feminist movement against the dictatorship. And for the sake of time, I won't talk about Carla Giovanni's beautiful Tiempo de Vals today, but I really want to try to untie this knot using just these two objects that I'm going to share about. So as we will see, this counter-visuality was disseminated via bulletins, pamphlets, posters, as the one that you're seeing here, and also in independent magazines opposing the regime. So it took shape, this counter-visuality, it took shape and has been inscribed in the archive thanks to the work carried out by different photographers, right? And it is my intent to reactivate this counter-visual memory through archival work, through writing, and also trying to developing a form of exploring or studying that orients itself by the documentary traces that reverberate in different visual objects. And this is also what I did in the book. So there is no doubt that the issue of visuality has been a central concern in feminist theory and feminist movements. Visuality, let us remember, is not synonymous with the visible, see? But rather refers to the infrastructures and processes that enable, in any given spatial temporal crossroads, certain ways of seeing or not seeing. Considered historically, we can also say that visuality allows us to elucidate how facts, movements, people's communities, and phenomena in general become or are made visible or are obscured or made invisible. So the photographic practices that I will display here in this table, in the screen, take us to the period in which the women's and feminist movement against the dictatorship emerged markedly in the public space in tandem with the expanding field of photography. So what you're seeing here is actually just a few examples from the independent magazine Analysis, and the editor of this magazine, Maria Olivia Mockenberg, she was one of the founders of the women's, Mujeres por la Vida, Women's for Life movement, that has nothing to do with like an anti-abortion movement, but like in democracy in that context. So of course they were really active and intentional in also disseminating the activism they were doing on the streets, right? Because they also happened to be the ones doing the journalism and being the photographers in the magazines, right? So there was this was visible, right? Of course, the regime tried to obscure it. But I am concerned not only with representation, right? And here I was thinking also about David's work, with gay themes in cinema and photography and how people sometimes are represented or not. This is more about how the historiography inscribed these attempts to visibility, right? So for instance, many collectives were engaging visuality as a practice, right? Like this is it's a collective, pobladoras, Boletín Palomita, because there were also popular feminisms, right, in different shanty towns. So the Domiltila group, a group of pobladoras, they had this bulletin, called Palomita, and they did one special issue on communication, and it was on mass media. And they had this kind of reflection, right? One of the pages in 1987 features the Miss Universe on top. Cecilia Boloco, we have a Miss Universe in 1987. She was on every TV screen. Pinochet was always commending her, Then you have Carmen Gloria Quintana, a portrait of a young woman who was burned alive by the policeman in 1986. And at the bottom, you have a pobladora, some neighbor resident from this shanty town, and the reflection is like, yeah, we might have a Miss Universe, but we don't have anything to eat, So it's like how is beauty framed? So that I also understand it as a photographic practice, how people are engaged with visuality actively, right, without being experts in photographic theory, basically. Okay. So I speak of photographic practice then because, as I propose in the subordination of photography, building on Ariela Sazulai's ideas, photography names more than the apparatus, the technique, or the photographic image itself, but it really names a relationship, right? And the result of that encounter between the camera, the photograph situation, the producer of the photo, and the one who looks at it exceeds at all times any of these separate entities. And lately, I've been thinking about the notion of practice inspired by Michel de Certeau's ideas and by Saidiya Hartman's reading of de Certeau. So practice is, for both authors, a calculated action determined by the absence of a proper locus, a provisional way of operating within the enemy's field of vision, a way of creating possibilities within the limitations of everyday life. So reading de Certeau, I was thinking, what are the limitations to everyday life under authoritarianism, right? Because de Certeau talks about walking, watching TV. So I was thinking oppression, censorship, disinformation, extreme surveillance, and torture, but also spectacle, denialism, indifference, and patriarchy. And this is very important, right? Because this is a dictatorship that preceded Pinochet's dictatorship, and in this, the feminists were really, really adamant, right? That authoritarianism was the problem, and not only a dictatorship. So how to make visible the many, many So here are a few examples, right? Again, different newspapers. This is a very famous consigna that was on the street for a democracy in the country and in the house, right? It's like these two kinds of, or again, a struggle against two dictatorships. So this was on the newspapers, right? This was discussed actively, especially 86, 87, 88, right? So again, how to make many forms of violence visible, perceptible, audible, legible when living under constant siege and surveillance. So through the production of visual infrastructures that, even if transitorily and without a proper locus, interrupt the enemy's field of vision, right? And this is a very common kind of photography. You know, you would see people pasting different posters, and then there are other photos of policemen actually taking them down. So sometimes they lasted for hours or minutes, right? So, and using any resources available, right? So I speak of photographic practices to account for the different forms of labor, affects, gestures, ideas, and discourses activated or enabled by photography, a civil practice that always exceeds the realm of experts. So this would be another photographic practice, right? It's beyond just like the taking the photo. So in Women in Movement, 1973, 1989, and the title is Mujeres en Movimiento, a book published shortly after the end of the dictatorship, the return to democracy. Feminist sociologist Sandra Palestro begins by warning, this is page 2, in the official history of Chile, there is a notable absence of women as a social movement. The efforts to record women's struggles in the pages of history have come from the protagonists and historians themselves. And they published a bunch of books throughout the 80s. The feminists, right? So this task of consignment and registration was markedly visual, and that was one of my arguments. And the traces of this work of documentation and memory live in different archives, as we have been seeing, right? Just a few of them. Of course, each of these photographic practices deserves comment and consideration, but I'll comment just this one briefly. So what you're seeing here is an issue of La Boletina, which was published shortly after the return of democracy, and shortly after the new president, Patricio Elwin, announced his cabinet. So, and I'm going to quote part of the text that it's kind of surrounding this photo that you see at the middle, and the title is Portrait of Gentleman with an Absent Lady, right? Retrato de caballeros con dama ausente. Even in Spanish, it sounds weird. But this is what it says. This situation, which is not without irony, if we consider it visually, is very serious. The Chilean woman, the one for democracy, the one who fought in defense of human rights, the one in exile, the one who stood in opposition and also assumed the head of the household, the one who has spent all these years developing theories and practice of solidarity and survival, who has worked on new concepts of health, justice, and democracy, who has been analyzing the cause of violence and searching for paths toward peace. And then I skip a few lines. To repeat the obvious, the one who washed their shirts, ironed their suits, made their meals, knitted their sweaters, and in Spanish it's very ironic. It's like su chombita, su comidita, all with like little, you know. The one who took care of their children, that woman is not here. Almost as amazing as the photo was President Elwin's response when asked about the absence of women in the cabinet. This is still the quote. Ministers are appointed for their abilities, he clarified. That is the end of the quote. I mean, there's a whole analysis after that, right? So this photo actually went viral not so long ago after the announcement of Gabriel Boric, our current president, first cabinet, right? And there were some tweeters like, oh, compare this like old men, you know, cabinet, and now we have all these colors, and because it's the first parity ministry, right? So you have equal men and women. But soon after, Boric tweets, you know, and he did not take long to come out in defense of Elwin, saying that the photo pre-Elwin included militares, right? And so in that kind of aspect resides the grandeur of Elwin, you know, that this photo had no militaries on it. So it is very, very, I don't know, very telling for me that the president of a self-declared feminist government, right, ignores what dozens of women's organizations denounced back then, right, the inability of the male political class to actually see them. And now, actually, a few weeks ago, there's a book recently published about the new feminist silencing of the 90s, you know, because the women organizations and feminist groups were completely silenced during the first 10 years of the Concertación. So this is something that, you know, it's coming back. So I'll keep sharing materials. So here you have another, right? Another news like somos la mayoría que los partidos no ven. We are the women in politics, we are the majority that the political parties do not see. So I'll just keep sharing with you some documents. This, for instance, is the feminist demands from 1983 that actually was the base for the women's demands in 1987, and this was part of the Concertación political program without ever saying that these had been feminist demands back then, right? So I'll keep sharing materials with you to see if you're as perplexed as I was. After I read in 2009 in an interview with a curator who was attempting to rescatar, right, the work of 3 photographers trained during the dictatorship, Kenna Lorenzini, Helen Hughes, and Leonora Vicuña. Visible, Invisible is actually the title of the exhibition and the book that was published in 2012. That she was not going to, and I'm going to quote her, she was not going to discuss the relationships between photography and gender during the dictatorship. This because, according to my research, this problem appeared more visibly in the first period of the transition, when photographers introduced the problem of the woman, or of woman, and the body into the image itself. Es el problema de la mujer y del cuerpo, right? But in the dictatorship, the problem of gender was not implied in photography. No estaba implícito en la fotografía. That's what she says. Because showing the city and the growing popular movements took priority. So while it may be true that one could formulate an argument around the absence of women in this epoch, I do not want to focus on that because this research is about documentary photography. End of the quote. So what a confusing, erratic argument, don't you think? Let me tell you, she missed a great opportunity. How could she not talk about the feminist practice of Kenna Lorenzini, I thought, her participation in the Women for Life movement? What about Helen Hughes' documentation of the many soup kitchens organized by pobladoras around the city? And she did talk about this, but always trying to rescue the artistic aspect of the photo, right? Like she was very concerned about, I need to show that these are photographers. But the argument was very, very erratic. So more importantly for me, her approach continued to reproduce the gender binarism that the Chilean feminist movement and also popular feminist organizations had fought to dismantle, starting with the sexual division of labor under patriarchy and the reduction of the question of gender, whatever that means, to the feminine, also whatever that means, and to the private sphere. Basically, if you don't see female bodies and babies, that's not a women's issue, right? It's not. Anyway. So a second example, in a questionable study entitled Women and Photography, the Visibility of the Feminine, and I'm kidding, La Visibilidad de lo Femenino, that's the title of the article. The author, a notable critic and historian of Chilean photography, suggests, and I quote him, that personal passions and inner worlds appear clearly in the photographs of Teresa Carvalho, Carmen Osa, Gestrudes de Moses, and Paz Errázuriz, 4 photographers who only share in common living in the 20th century and being identified as women, right? However, this historian finds shared explicit thematic motifs in these different photographers, images of the female body, the constant presence of children, and the determining aspects of the maternal gaze. And I could keep quoting him, but I mean, I published an article about this, so I don't want to bother you with all of this nonsense. And I want to open a parenthesis to actually quote the important work that Cynthia Schuffer, a researcher, a photographer, and archivist, our colleague, has done in the past few years, reactivating unseen archives with care and generating methodologies in collaboration with the photographers. So this is a very, very different kind of work. Because needless to say, I'm not suggesting that we don't need to recuperate, right, and disseminate understudied or little-known archives. What I'm saying is that more often than not, this rescue effort relies on essentialist and patriarchal conceptions about the feminine, whatever that means again, gender, author photography, and the artistic dimension of documentary photography. So let me share a passage from feminist theorist Nelly Ritter, and I put it here because she's very complex, and translating this passage is also difficult, so let's see if we understand this. Theoretical practice should accompany each movement of identity and each discourse as a reflexive exercise of vigilant counterinterpretation that helps us to interrogate conventions of meaning naturalized by dominant ways of feeling, thinking, and speaking, including those ways that invade feminism when being a woman or being a feminist is exhausted in the self-affirmation of a pre-established identity that does not sufficiently distrust its own definitional framework. So inspired by this counter-interpretative impulse, I asked the following questions. how to resist the indexical function of the photo. That illustrative drive of the archive that urged me to point out and tell you, like, look, here the women protesting, right? And that's how actually the indexical, descriptor. It's like mujeres protestando. To resist this impulse, which besides offer no guarantees, and here this is an excellent book by Elisa Valdez, she's a political scientist. She effectively demonstrated in her study about women's movement in Chile that bourgeois women also mobilized their gender identity as women and the role of mothers and housewives to protest against Allende and the popular unity. So being a woman is not revolutionary in and of itself, right? So there's no guarantee in the photo. So how to resist this impulse, right? So I guess first it would be necessary to consider why the organizers behind this protest against the dictatorship chose to do so as women, right? And this is also what she studied, so I'm not gonna study it again. I can just quote her. Then what forms of protest was this that marked a beginning, right? As this analysis issue celebrated on its cover. This is a cover from 1985, and the protest had begun 3 years earlier, right? But it's like parte la protesta, the protest begins. So what kind of protest is this one? That it's kind of marking a beginning, right? And also, why was it that it was so documented and so disseminated in different publications? And here I'm circling all the photographers that you can see on the frame, right? So there were always many photographers documenting these demonstrations, and they appear in other frames, right? And we could consider this as kind of like an imperfection of the photo, right? It's like, oh, but that's what interests me. So another question prompted by Richard's counter-interpretative gesture is, what processes are invisibilized when women, just as women, are simply rescued from the archive, right? Women photographers, photos of women, photos by women. I don't deny this may be an uncomfortable, even a radical question, but I think it's a necessary one, I think, because we're witnessing a kind of rescue boom, right? Not only locally, but also globally. And here, apologies for this simplistic visualization. I did on Google Images, but I think it helps to illustrate the point. These are just a few of the books that have been published in the past 10, 20 years, right? For over 4 decades, photography scholars and photography departments at different museums and universities have been reproducing patriarchal modes of recovery, documentation, dissemination, and criticism. So here we see several books about women photographers. Although this rescue boom, it must be said, it's neither new nor specific to the field of photography. One difference is that now in this Me Too era, Netflix and Hollywood, Walmart, Univision, all want to take part of this, right? They all want to be feminists. And we know that patriarchal capitalism operates by expanding its borders, co-opting everything in its path. However, I do believe it is worth interrogating the editorial, historiographical, and curatorial efforts that are fueling and enabling this boom, right? So there are several histories of women photographers that have been published, written, or exhibited. Every news story that gets published laments the lack of such histories to justify the new effort, and also to explain the difficulty involved in carrying out projects of such magnitude, right? Over and over and over. And I must point out the eminently modern underpinning of such projects, because whether they say it or not, they always aspire to cover the entire world. A world story mundial de women photographers, world history of human photographers, right? And in this, they cannot but fail. And while these acknowledge, we know it's impossible to take, to cover all the world, the projects never stop celebrating this achievement undertaken by providing figures, numbers, right? So let's take a look at the 2 more recent efforts, and I told you this would appear again. So the one that you see in the middle, this history brings together the work of, and I quote, 300 women photographers from around the world, from the invention of the medium up to the 21st century. That's a description of a world history of women photographers, published in 2020 by Luz Lebach and Marie Robert. The editors also say they invited 160 authors to give an account of the diverse trajectories of the various photographers included in the book, photographers from all over the world, but especially from Europe and the United States. Another recent exhibition, The Great Woman Behind the Camera, that I was able to see at the Met a few years ago, brought together photos by, and I quote, 128 women photographers from around the world, produced between the 1920s and 1950s. This was a little bit more, acotado. In the curatorial text, Andrea Nelson, the curator, claims that it is time to, and I quote, time to broaden the lens with which the history of modern photography has been portrayed. But isn't it time to change or modify the lens, I wonder? Is it a mere expansion enough? I think not. right? And there's actually an excellent review by Anne Macaulay that does like a full dissection of this exhibition. For instance, half of the photographers were born either in Germany or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so she's like this much more a phenomenon of a diasporic phenomenon of women fleeing Europe. You know, that would have been more interesting to study than, oh, look, they excel in fashion, in photojournalism, and, you know, kind of reproducing the same categories. That's just one thing. So I think much of these, I mean, these world histories, they do erase, you know, they do obscure. And I recognize it's a complex issue, because how do I dare to question this rescue effort, right? How to criticize the fact that curators and historians want to make visible the work of women photographers who, as a product of the patriarchal foundation of history with capital letters and the archive with capital letters, have been ignored or relegated. Yes, I mean, I can't help but to draw attention to and even be suspicious of these feminist rescue gestures, because as feminist philosopher Alejandra Castillo suggests in her reading of Julieta Kirkwood, and I quote her, by incorporating women into the historical narrative, one can inadvertently only repeat the affirmation of the recognition granted by the dominant order. I ask then, is it possible to rehearse forms of feminist criticism not limited to identity discourses? Women photographers. And interpret, disseminate, and write about photographic practices, not exclusively about women photographers, without reinforcing the same patriarchal paradigms that historically have segregated these practices. And I don't think there are definite answers to this question, and I don't think these are easy not to untangle, as I said, but I do want to explore this opacity, right, this triad. Because in photographic criticism, there have been very, very few attempts to generate other ways of doing history, of plotting genealogies, or of writing, illuminating these continuities, echoes, and reverberations. So at the end, the rescue effort ends up being merely additive, right? A new history, perhaps a more inclusive and even an alternative history, but which continues to produce successive segregations and erasures, not only geopolitical in nature, right? Like there were no more photographers in Europe than in America, right? But it's just like this idea, but also historical, starting with the erasure of the previous histories whose objective had also been to repair the invisibility of many of those same photographers. I don't think it's a question of like, oh, you need to add more South American photographers in your history, because the structure is the problem, right? So I end this first long and more belligerent part of my talk echoing what art historian Linda Notchlin already pointed out in an often quoted essay from 1971. That is what is depressing, right? It's like 50 years saying the same thing. So why have there not been great women artists? That is the title of her essay. The mere denunciation of the absence of women photographers or women artists in world or national histories is not enough, because this must be accompanied by a critical consideration of the patriarchal underpinnings of the cultural field being studied and of the historiography of that period. She actually talks about operations and how women can be a catalyst of this kind of like intellectual, interrogation. And that critical consideration enables and even propels a different kind of historiography necessarily, right? Because you need to write differently. So now to the second part of this talk. I have been thinking for some time now about how to study photographic practices linked to the women's and feminist movement against the dictatorship from a feminist perspective. And this concern emerged while I was making the final revisions to the insubordination of photography. A few times I was asked if my book addressed the issue of gender. I responded with some variation of what do you mean the issue of gender? And my interlocutors would clarify, do you talk about women's photography? Or do you study women photographers? And I usually responded that no, that my book did not study women's photography, because what's that? Fotografía de mujeres. Also, I did say that I did talk about initiatives promoted by a group of independent photographers, and also describe specific photos taken by XYZ, Paz Errázuriz, Kena Lorenzini, Lucho Navarro, Helen Hughes, Lucho Weinstein, Hector Lopez, Claudio Perez, so on and so forth. Not a very convincing answer, to be honest. And the reflections I've been developing since then, including this essay, are perhaps a sort of a deferred response. In the exception, there is no feminist politics, reminds us Alejandra Castillo regarding Kirkwood's historiographic work. Indeed, a fundamental lesson of feminism is we must learn to create continuities where there seem to be none, because patriarchal history operates through erasing and cutting. And Joan Scott, a famous feminist historian, calls this the kind of echo reverberations, right? Like it's a fantasy that you need to identify with a movement that was prior. So that's how the fantasy of women emerges. So I was already thinking about this idea of feminist reverberations when I started working with the unpublished archive of Paz Errázuriz. For those of you who are not familiar with her work, suffice to say that she's a well-known photographer, recognized both nationally and internationally, and this kind of description really bothers Paz. The only photographer and one of the few women, not surprised there, who has been awarded the National Prize of Visual Arts in Chile in 2017. So Paz and I started working in mid-2021. Paz told me that she wanted to make a book about women, literally, with part of her unpublished photographic material from the 80s. And I told her, like, what women? I'll counter, because I knew that she has spent decades, 4 or 5 decades, photographing cis and trans women alike, documenting the various ways of becoming women, right? Children, old people, Mapuche women, pobladoras, bourgeois women, So I thought we had to be intentional about that in our exploration, especially now in this feminist movement, right? Because everyone wants to publish things about women. So Imperfect Archive is organized in very simple categories and can be viewed and read in any order. I think there's a copy down somewhere there. The categories at the beginning and at the end, the first one is women and the last one is protest, serve to tie together but also to untie these categories, and also the vision of Paz as an exceptional author or as an exceptional photographer. I also wanted to kind of like counter that. So we began working side by side, sitting at her desk, another table, looking at protest photos on her computer screen because her archive has been completely digitized in recent years by Zenfoto UDP. So I was also not working with a real archive, and that was really, I talked about that also in the book, that expectation that you're like, oh, dusty documents, and no romanticism. It was all digital photography, or digitized photographs, right? And the feeling of deja vu sometimes was so intense that at first, I actually doubted what she was telling me, right? That most of these photos had never been published. I was like, but yet I myself had seen the same photos, right? The same photos, especially this one. One of them with no credit in publications edited by the MEMCH, the Women's, Coordinadora de Movimientos de Mujeres, right? Women's Organizations Coordinator. So perhaps one of these photos had been published in La Boletina Chilena. No, she said, like very, categorical. I was like, okay, no. So see, these are almost the same photos. So one of these photos, I'm completely lost now where I am. Okay, see. One of these photos frames a group of people in a square in downtown Santiago. The jet of a water cannon enters violently through the right side of the frame. But more powerful, it seems to me, is the gesture of resistance embodied by those fists held high, right? Like there are a few people like this. It is not difficult to complete the scene with the police that will surely come up shortly after to repress this small but stubborn demonstration. The group is standing behind a large banner made of cloth. They cling to it as if it were a shield, but it's like what a fragile, soft shield this is. On it, I can read the words MUDECHI, and this is the acronym for the group Mujeres de Chile, and also the word women in smaller letters. The other photo on your right, the one I remember having seen on the cover of Boletina Chilena, also focused on a group of protesters in a square. In both photos, the protesters do not appear alone, and the presence of these other people who are not protesters, is significant. In the first one, towards the center, you see a state agent. There's a weapon, a uniform, helmet, and boots. And the second one could be a photographer, but I doubt because he has his hand on his pockets, so that pose doesn't convince me. But the one that appears entering the frame, right through the left side, is indeed a photographer because he's focusing his camera. In the second image, I think I identify a photographer on the right side. She appears like split in half, and here she has a bulky bag, but I might be wrong, but it doesn't matter because I've seen other photos where there are photographers, so I'll come back to that. So the first time Paz showed me these photos, I thought, of course, she also went to marches, vigils, posters, stickers, press conference, all of these kinds of things, but we have never seen these photos of Paz. We have only seen very beautiful photos of Paz Errázuriz, right? And of course, she also brought her camera. So the photos organized in alphanumeric sequences that I was never able to understand. They had but this continually revealed Paz journeys through the city, right? There are portraits, there are anodyne registers like this. There are photos that repeat with similar angles and approaches, you know, the simple but eloquent slogan displays in marches and protests, donde están. This is a feminist, you know, turn of democracia en el país y en la casa, democracia en el país y en la cama, right? And I think that's important. So I insist that the photos that impressed me most were not those that confirm past indisputable talent or exceptional gaze, you know, and I mean, there were an abundance of these photos, but the photos like this, right, like the protest photos. They really situated herself in the place, right? And I think these iterative records help us situate and visualize past sustained photographic practice and her place within this movement, right? Like sometimes marching, sometimes turning her back to take the photo, then marching again. I mean, there are no indications of past gaze, right, in them. We see protesters with their arms raised and their fists clenched, with their palms open, bodies marching in line, sitting on the street, et cetera, banners. Again, what these photos suggest to me and their joint visualization reveals something that it's impossible, but you can imagine it, right? And memory helps too, that past participated in these acts and also documented them. And this is part of her situated learning because she was a self-taught photographer, as many photographers in that era. So the expanding photographic archive of feminisms contained countless photos of March 8 commemorations, and this was the first day of protest in the history of dictatorship. People started protesting on March 8, right, in 1978. So these two photos were taken on March 8, 1985. A few days before, on March 3, a strong earthquake hit Chile's central region, and given the disaster that unfolded and the proximity of March 8, many women groups called for an emergency action of solidarity. The action held on March 8 in open defiance of a state of siege that had been in effect for 5 months, so people were not protesting for 5 months, right? Was much less massive and less iconic than other March 8 commemorations, and I write less iconic in between quotation marks because although there are several photos of this demonstration, you know, it does not seem to be registering the collective memory as like an important March 8 commemoration. The photos, as you can see, are not identical, but they are quite similar. And when I look at them together side by side, I realize the angles and, you know, the direction of each take do not match. Paz took the photo, positioning herself in front diagonally. Nelson Muñoz Mera, who is the author, most likely made the uncredited photo in Boletina Chilena, and it was published also in El Futuro es Nuestro, The Future is Ours, about which I will say a few things if you bear with me. In this photo, another photographer appears in the frame, so it's this one, right? And here you see the half photographer that maybe it's not a photographer. So what the hypothesis that I want to rehearse here, and I insist that this is not yet a well-rounded argument, is that documentary reverberations, a word that I will never be able to say in English, embodied in that sensation of déjà vu that becomes manifest when considering together photographic records taken by different photographers, allow us to dismantle or at least to counter fixed aesthetics paradigms and patriarchal categories such as the notion of the author, the ideas of exceptionality and artistic genius. And these reverberations also ask us to consider how did feminist and women-led photographic practices take shape despite the ongoing repression, censorship, and the prevailing machismo. Because as it was the case of many, Paz Errázuriz was also a self-taught photographer, and her school was the street. And this persistent and daring way of learning, as Nelly Richard has said, was a form of disobeying the double mandate of seclusion imposed on women, by dictatorship and by patriarchy. So como un desacato doble, Nelly Richard, right? And there's an anecdote I can tell you later in the Q&A about Paz Errázuriz. Please ask me about that because I can say a few things about this. So let me turn now briefly to El Futuro es Nuestro. The first time I saw this, and I'm going to just play this video while I described it. The first time I saw this book, it was laying on a table in a video I received by email. The small book emerges out from this initial black that completely covers the frame. It is centered in the middle of a white background in an overhead shot, so it looks almost as if it were floating right above the surface that serves as a support, the table. Shortly, two hands protected with latex gloves appear from the bottom of the frame. The hands take the book carefully, as you are seeing now, and begin to turn the pages slowly. There's a voice off the camera that is directing the action of the hands. Don't hurry, it looks good from over here, right there, yeah, careful, you know. In 2017, I was invited to review 3 of the books that would be part of a publication, a review of the Chilean photo book, una revisión al fotolibro chileno, and one of them was this book, El Futuro es Nuestro, from 1986. Since I did not know the book and it was not available in digital archives, the editors sent me this video. And given my interest in the expanding field of photography, in the practice that facilitated the reproduction and circulation of photos in different platforms, and in the various frames that help to recontextualize them, and the images, the video itself got my attention. I was like, I want to write about the video. It seemed to me that this particular reframing isolated the book and made it weightless. I was also interested in the performance of these expert hands, right, protected with surgical gloves, the way they turn the pages with extreme care, the praise they receive. It's look good, you're doing good. What look good, I asked, because surely the photos, but not the text. I had to keep pausing it to be able to read what the text said, right? So it's like the photos look good for sure, but not the text that supplement their meanings and contextualize them, right? So this particular reframing, one that isolated the book from its worlds and that focused exclusively on the photos displayed on it, made me think about the place that this book had occupied in its present and in relation to other practice from the expanding photographic field. Also about the successive displacement and various lives of this militant book, right? Since the coordinator, MEMCH 83, this coordinator that coordinated different women organizations, published a bulletin periodically, this one right here, Boletina Chilena, that I've also talked about, I began to consider El Futuro es Nuestro as an instance of feminist archival practice, right? Because they were always publishing things, so why to publish something that was more beautiful, right? So the book was published in 1986, right before a much anticipated March 8, to give even more visibility to the women's movement, and also to celebrate the organizing work carried out by different groups and collectives until then. Thanks to funds provided by a German organization, the MEMCH had been able to produce a high-quality book and distribute it for free at meetings and rallies, although I learned all of this much later. What I thought about then, while I was actually watching the video, was that this little book had surely been shared and seen collectively, that it had been passed from hand to hand in demonstrations and assemblies, reaching me over 30 years later, right, through a video screen carefully held by two expert hands that treated it like a delicate museum piece, like an archival object. And given the context in which this book appeared and the temporality it announced, El Futuro es Nuestro, like the future is ours, and 1986 was considered the decisive year, the year that when Pinochet would actually fall down, when the popular protest would kind of, took down Pinochet, overthrow him, seemed important to me to address this organizational capacity of this movement that had tried to address and overcome with little success core ideological conflicts between women-led groups, feminists, popular feminists, lesbian, women affiliated to traditional political parties. And that's why I said women's and feminist, movement, because El Movimiento Feminista was actually like, not a party, but with capital letters, right? So, and I also wanted to emphasize the non-exceptional quality of this militant book that had become a collector's item. Because this is not a unique document, we have seen, it's one of many that emerged in this key period. So I wanted to eschew ontological questions and focus right on the performative dimension of this publication, right? So instead of asking what makes of El Futuro Nuestro a photo book, ontological question, asking what do militant books like El Futuro es Nuestro do or attempt to do in their own present, right? Ultimately, I wanted my review to present this book not as a world apart, but as a part of a world making, right? An expanding archive comprised of independent bulletins, magazines, brochures, all objects produced to disseminate demands, expose problems, share ideas. Needless to say, most of the stuff that I researched was left out of the review, it's 500 words, but also shortly after accepting the invitation, I was provided with editing guidelines. Editing norms was actually the word, normas editoriales. These norms provoked further questions. The general editor, Horacio Fernández, who actually acted as a general, yeah, very, lot of authority. Okay, so Horacio Fernández requested that I address the author's methodology and the author's program. Other indications also took for granted the figure of the author. Do not indicate date of birth or death. Do not indicate nationality. Who was the author of this book, I thought, right? It's like, was there an author in singular, in masculine form? Thinking about the MEMCH, this coordinator who represented more than 20 grassroots organizations, and also thinking about Nelson Muñoz, the cis-man photojournalist who actually took all the photos published in this book. How had they become in touch? There were so many women photographers, right? What to say about this unlikely collaboration? So one of the first ideas that I jotted down was the issue here is not so much who the author of these photos is, but why this book was made and what this particular montage of photos and text does, right? And for me, the centering the figure of the author did not imply ignoring Muñoz's work in the project. Actually, I interviewed him, and that's how I learned about all of this. So I learned that he lived downtown. Some of the organizers of the Mensch also lived. Actually, he was partnered, and this is how it all works. It's like we're humans. So Muñoz was partnered with Ana Veronica Peñas. She was a journalist, was part of the Mensch, right? Who also participated in the movement. So actually, Peña designed the book. She chose all the texts. Muñoz took the photos in protests around the area, sometimes on, when he was on assignment and he would travel. So that's why you see some portraits from like Mapuche women. He went to the south. So, and then there are other specific days, right? Like International Women's Day. So basically it was made in collaboration very like this. So in the first peer review round, Fernandez, as I said, acting as a general, questioned my emphasis on the context. This is not a history book, he told me, nor a study of feminist struggles during dictatorship. And he urged me to focus more on the photos and on the design of the photo book. But I told him, how could I talk about these photos without referring to the history of the women's and feminist organizations that have promoted initiatives like this, or without evoking so many other similar photos, right, taken by other photographers in the same protest by Muñoz's colleagues. Again, I don't contend with the fact that this might be the only book of photographs about the women's and feminist movement edited by the men coordinator, published during the dictatorship. And that reason enough is, enough reason to include it in a photo books, right? However, despite this singularity, I insist on considering part of a constellation of photographic practices that display a particular and specific counter-visuality. So as I said, I'm just going to cut here. One of the most important, marches that appears in that book, and that we have already seen these photos, is the march Somos Más, We Are More, organized by Women for Life movement on October 30th, 1985. Just so you know, between 1983 and 1985, Women for Life movement organized and participated in more than 170 acts of protest, including assemblies, marches, hunger strike, press conferences, everything, right? Meeting with officials, etc. So as we already saw, Analysis did extensive coverage of this march, right? There are photos by Nelson Muñoz, Patricia Alfaro, Paz Errázuriz, who also document the same march. And here you can actually see, as I said before, there are a few photographers, right, on the frame. And on the right side, there's a cameraman, and there's a very famous documentary that you can watch on YouTube, Somos Más, by Pedro Chasquel, and Pablo Salas, and I think, I imagine those are them, right? That particular shadow, I think this is Muñoz himself taking the photo, but that is more like a big video camera, right? And that documentary is very beautiful, actually. So photos disseminated in magazines, bulletins, or photo books, such as El Futuro es Nuestro, taken by different photographers, show the material transformation of the public sphere. And such transformation was due in large part to the women's organizing, right? Women understood here as a collective political subject. And this movement and its persistent documentation through the reproduction and circulation of similar photos in different media also expanded the protest in space and time. And this photographic expansion in turn enabled other ways of seeing and expressing the protest. This is why these are mujeres protestando, right? Destabilizing the polarity cemented by the Cold War regionally and by pro-Pinochet media locally. It was extremely convenient to criminalize the popular protest, as well as simple. Those who called to protest against the government, the dictatorship, had to be Marxist agents, Soviet or Cuban envoys, seeking to reinstall communism in Chile. The chorus of photos documenting banners and bands with affirmative messages, we are more, the future is ours. They were very intentional about this. No political party signs in these marches, right? Like no mention of any kind of revolution, They raise open hands, slides of people marching, they use flowers, a rope to connect protesters, all of this, and on top of that, the scattered expression of photos of these demonstrations urge us not to exhaust our reflection on a single object or subject, right, be it a photographer or a photo book. And with this, I'm going to finish. So reverberation is the persistence of sound in space, a type of sound reflection that occurs when the sound emitted by one source collides and bounces off another surface. If the sound produced is intelligible by itself, it is called an echo, right? If it is mixed with the original sound, modifying it, it is called reverberation. So I resort to these sound images to counteract the tendency to talk about photos in terms of muteness or silence. Also, above all, because this sensorial metonymy suggests what happens to the photos in their different itinerancies, right? In the case of photographs, a reverberation occurs when seeing or remembering having seen a similar photo on a different media. The documentary reverberation begins to take shape with the dissemination of photos taken by different photographers in different media, spreads or mutates according to the resonances that occur between similar photos published concurrently or at different times. Because some of these photos, I just saw them a few months ago, right? So I would like to propose that orienting ourselves by this documentary reverberations is a way of doing feminist criticism. This way of doing things begins with simple acts, centering the idea of the exceptional, the unique or the particular, avoiding teleological readings or saying, for instance, about past Errázuriz photographic records, here we can see the photographer that is going to be, right? This is like before she was a photographer. Because this is how masculine and patriarchal photographic criticism has operated and continues to operate, following the straight line drawn by the figure of the author and his work, reproducing categories, ways of seeing, and chronologies that endorse the idea of evolution, of progress. Listening to documentary reverberations means highlighting the occasional presence of other photographers in the frame, also implies not ignoring and even less disdaining the repetitive quality of photographic records of protests that abound in the visual archive of the civic military dictatorship and in the expanding archive of feminisms, archives that do not exist in a single space. Thank you. That was very long. No? Okay.
Thank you so much for this wonderful, amazing talk. We have a few minutes for questions now, or for the Q&A. So if you have any questions for us,
Hi. So during the part when you were talking about the protests in the 1970s from the Mujeres por la Vida, you referenced something called the past gaze. Like there was no past gaze. Could you clarify what that means?
Past gaze? Okay. I was talking too fast. Past Errázuriz?
Yeah.
Gaze, like when you see these photos of protests, you know, Paz Errázuriz has such a distinct style of portraiture, and so if you see these photos, you cannot recognize that she did them, right? So, and I think that's important. It's because people, for instance, curators who have actually worked with Paz's archives, right? Like, I mean, she has hundreds of photos that have never been seen until now in this book. But she tells me, like, when curators come to her house to actually do a new exhibition, they always ask her to show her the series that have already been published. So it's like kind of a reproducing the same kind of imagery, right? So the first photo in the book, actually, it's a statue of Delia, if you see it. And she told me, like, I love this photo. Please include this photo in the book. And I was like, why you have never exhibited before? Because curators don't like them. They never ask about it, you know? So it's like, so again, because maybe in that photo you cannot see past gaze. So curators are not interested in that. But I am interested. Yeah. So it's paz, comita, es, gaze. La mirada de paz, basically, in Spanish. See?
On a personal note, are you have an interest in photography and taking pictures yourself? You certainly have a great, in New York City, you have a lot of things going on.
I do take a lot of photos with my phone, yes. But I mean, I tried at the beginning when I was writing, when I started to write about photography, I tried to understand how it works in terms of, you know, like kind of like focal lengths and all of that. And I know how it works, but I can't do it. I mean, in theory, I know how it works, but when I grab a camera and they tell me like, oh man, the focus, I can't. So I guess it's just because I was already taking photos with, yeah. But yeah, so I don't take photos professionally, no, just as anyone else. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about Paz? You said, oh, I'll tell you more.
Okay, yeah, so a few anecdotes. So Paz, her first book, she did it in her house. It's La Historia de una Gallina, and she self-published it, right? She took photos of a hen that lived in her house. She did a beautiful photo, you know, for her kids. And then in 1973 or 74, if I'm not mistaken, Borowicz, who was an important, he was a photographer himself. He was a refugee who came from Europe. And he founded the first photography school at Universidad de Chile, and he trained many photographers. And Paz showed him her book, you know, because she wanted to study photography. And Bob Borowicz told Paz that she shouldn't bother because a housewife was never going to be a photographer. And like the day after, Paz went out and started taking photos on the street. So that's why also Nelly Richard talks about this desacato, right? Like this kind of like, you tell me I need to stay home, I'm gonna go out and actually I'm gonna take photos at brothels and at like the places where nobody else goes, right? Because that's what Paz did. And the other anecdote is like when Paz was already a photographer taking photos, so she went to the Chilean IRS, Servicio de Impuestos. When you initiate activities as a professional, you have to have your own, boletas, the honorario, receipt, and you need to say, what is your profession? Something that for me was also difficult because I studied literature, so mine is like services in language, and blah. They have like all these weird categories, right? So she says, she told the person, the bureaucrat there, also, she was a woman, it's like, okay, yeah, my profession is fotógrafa. And the person, well, in Spanish we have this different, right? Fotógrafo, fotógrafa. And the bureaucrat told her like, no, no existe, eso no existe. Usted no existe. Usted es fotógrafo. It's like you're, I'm kind of a male photographer. So she's like, even in that you were denied existence, right? Like, I mean, this very, yeah. And then there's a very beautiful moment in a documentary called The City of Photographers by Sebastián Moreno. He interviews many photographers, but there's also kind of like a gender binary because you see women are interviewed always at her houses or in interiors, Paz, Helen Hughes, Kiana Lorenzini, whereas the men photographers are interviewed on the street, right? But when Moreno interviews Paz, it's very beautiful because there's a vacillation. She says like, she's talking about the AFI, the Association of Independent Photographers, and she's like, it was a very beautiful moment because it was actually the first time that you were able to name yourself photographer, right? But in Spanish, it's like, nos pudimos nombrar a nosotros fotógrafas. Like it's like there's an hesitation where she uses first the masculine and then the feminine. So, I mean, these little details that we are obsessed with these things, right? Yeah.
Any other questions?
Was she excited with the book when it came out?
Really excited. Yeah, and it's a really beautiful project because it really was. I mean, I met Paz a few years ago, not long ago, when I was doing the first book. But there was an exhibition in Chile about Chile from Within. That it's a famous exhibition that. Was mounted by Susan Meiselas in collaboration with all of these photographers in 1990, and it was an itinerant exhibition that actually was never shown in Chile for many years. It was shown and published in the US, here, actually, no, in the US. It traveled from many, many different places, and 25 years later, after, right, in 2015, the Spanish translation of Chile from Within, Chile desde adentro, actually was published in Chile, again with a new edition, with another text, and they did a beautiful exhibition. And I wrote a review of the exhibit, and I published it online on a magazine that a few people read, but all of the photographers read that, and they liked it. So that's when I met Paz, and then we started chatting, and then my book came out. She read it, and she told me, like, you know what, I read your book, I really like it. And I think now this archive that I have makes sense because I never thought that I would show these photos, all of these protest photos and photos of women, and we could do something. But this was 2 years ago, so we start talking. Then we apply for a fondar, like how things work to get money to do things. So it was all kind of in that distance, I was in New York, she was in Santiago, so she would send me 80 photos. I would look at them, I was like, okay, let's use this one, not this ones, and then, okay, the categories, what do we do? But the book tells all of this. It's a kind of like really the writing is the process of the making of the book as well, yeah. So, yeah.
Has there been any critical reception already?
This book? Yes, well, it was just published in July. But we did a launching in Santiago at the Bellas Artes, at the Museum of, which is also ironic because Paz was censored from that museum back in the 80s. So it was very special. I mean, afterwards she has exhibited there, but it was packed. I mean, there were like over 100 people. We printed 500 books, and that day we sold 80. Also, we did because we got sponsorship from the government, the book for us was cost-free and for the publisher as well, because we provided the money for the book, so we told the publisher, Metales Pesados, we want this book to be very cheap. Not affordable, cheap, because books in Chile are expensive. So that book in Chile in pesos could be 30,000 pesos, 35,000, and it cost 12,000. And with that day, we sold it at 10,000, so people were buying like lots of copies, maybe to sell them more expensive later.
I was living in 1973 in Mexico, and I saw many Chileans exiled into Mexico and formed the Universidad Metropolitana. Have you met a photographer that have lived in the exile, not only in Mexico but in other parts of the world or Latin America?
Well, Marcelo Montesino, women photographer, I'm not sure I've met. Marcelo lives in Washington, D.C., and he was very close with this group as well. Yeah. And then I've met many people in exile. So in New York City, there's a big community, and actually one of the main, Nieves Aires, she's the first actually victim of torture to win a case based on a gender. It's a como, I don't even know how to say this in English, como violación de los derechos humanos con causa de género, ¿sí? Porque fue violación, o sea, rape. Yeah, but women photographers in exile, really I haven't met. Because what happens is that the famous photographers left, right? Some of them left because they were feared to be prosecuted. So then the people who stayed, they formed themselves as photographers in Chile. And that's also this division between Chile from within and not, it's like, so the photographers who stayed were actually documenting the day-to-day, they would go. It's very beautiful to actually, talk to them. And I asked Paz about this because we would see like the las tiras de contacto, where you have like the whole negative, and you would see protest, birthday, niece, nephew, and she's like, it's like your journal. You would go with the camera with the same 36 photos, and you would take photos in the morning at the protest, and you would go to the birthday party, then you go to the, so, and she actually described them as a journal, like como diario de vida, yeah.
And I also traveled to New Zealand, and when I went there, I went to the university in Auckland, and I found a Chilean professor that was part of the Kiwi Latinos from Chile that exiled all the way up to New Zealand.
Nice. Yeah, the other day I was listening to a talk about film, and like the theory of this scholar was that all of the film produced in Chile was filmed in exile. So it's like because, photography was produced in Chile, but most of the filmmakers left, and they were producing films about Chile, but in France, in Cuba, in the States. So it's interesting also to compare that, how the film production was made abroad and photographic production was actually made in Chile.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. We'd like to invite you to join us for reception in our periodicals alcove. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much.